Earth Systems 3209, Unit 2, Historical Geology. This presentation will focus on references from the text in Chapter 6, Chapter 8, Appendix A, and Appendix B. Unit 2, Topic 3.2, Describing the Methods of Fossilization. This presentation will focus on describing three conditions necessary for fossilization and describing the formation of various types of fossils. The three conditions necessary for fossilization include: number 1, rapid burial. When an organism dies, its soft parts are eaten by scavengers or can be decomposed by bacteria. However, if the organism is quickly buried by sediment, it is protected from the many environmental factors that help break down living organisms. The second condition necessary for fossilization is the presence of hard body parts. Fossils of organisms that contain hard parts are abundant in the fossil record, but only rare traces of soft-tissued organisms are seen as fossils. Number 3, low oxygen environment. In a low oxygen environment, there is less bacteria and decomposition is slower. Thus, organisms tend to have a greater chance to become fossilized when found in a oxygen-poor environment. So in summary, the three conditions necessary for fossilization will be rapid burial, the presence of hard parts, and a low oxygen environment. There are 5 main methods for fossilization, and fossils can be preserved in the rock record in several ways. The first method of fossilization includes petrifaction, a second, carbonization, a third, mold and cast, a fourth, preservation, such as freezing in ice, mummification, and preservation in amber. And a fifth type of fossilization are trace fossils. These include tracks, burrows, coprolites, and stomach stones. In the textbook, you can find references on the methods of fossilization on pages 183 to 186. The first method of fossilization is petrifaction. Petrifaction occurs when the small internal cavities and pores of the original structure are filled with precipitated matter. This can occur when cell walls and solid materials are removed and replaced by mineral matter carried by underground water. Sometimes internal details and structures are retained. And this is the only method of fossilization where internal details are retained. Any other type of fossilization does not retain internal details. They only retain surface structures. So if we look at the diagram to the right, we look at here is a fossilized wood. A fossilized log, such as this one, that's fossilized by the process of petrifaction, had water at one time flowing through the soil. This log must have been buried deep within the sediment, and as water passed through, it replaced the wood structure cell by cell. And if you were to look at the cross-section of the log on the inside, you would actually see the internal details of all the rings of the log preserved. This method is called petrifaction. The second method of fossilization is carbonization. Carbonization occurs when fine sediment encloses delicate matter, such as leaves, in an oxygen-poor environment. As time passes, pressure of the overlying sediment squeezes out liquid and gas components of the organism, which leaves behind a thin residue of carbon. In the diagram to the right, we see a fossil of a bee or a wasp. As time passed, the sediment that squeezed the organism deep into the sediment squeezed out the volatile components such as gases and liquids. And all that remained is a thin film of carbon residue that's found on the rock layer. This type of fossilization here, it does not preserve any of the internal details. It just preserves the external features, such as the wings and the body. The third method of fossilization includes mold and cast. Mold and cast often preserves a replica of a plant or animal in sedimentary rocks. An organism is buried in sediment and then is dissolved by underground water, leaving a hollow depression or an impression, which we call a mold. In the diagram to the right, we see the formation of a mold. In the first diagram, we see a shell that's basically dissolved away, or after leaving an impression in mud, gets pulled away by some kind of external force. This leaves an impression in the sediment, which will later be filled in with sediment or mineral matter. So after the mold is formed, the mold shows only the original shape of the surface markings of the organism. It does not reveal the internal structure. When minerals or sediment fills in the hollow depression or impression, it forms what's called a cast. And the cast will be a reverse replica of the original organism. The fourth method of fossilization is called preservation. During preservation, the original remains can be preserved in ice or in tree sap, which is called amber. Both ice and amber protects the organism from decay, therefore it provides an oxygen-free environment, which is one of the conditions that promotes fossilization, and from pressures that would crush the organisms. The entire animal has been preserved, even the soft parts which used to decay and disappear. This type of fossilization is commonly called fossilized intact, where the organism remains all of its structure, soft and hard parts. In the diagram to the right, we see some fossilized amber, which has a mosquito that existed in prehistoric times. So insects preserved in tree sap, such as amber, and this was the fundamental principle behind the movie Jurassic Park, where the old man's cane was made out of amber, and it had a fossilized insect in which they took blood to replicate the DNA to make dinosaurs. The fifth method of fossilization is called trace fossils. Trace fossils are left in the rock by an animal. Such trace fossils could include tracks. These are animal footprints or other footprints made in soft sediment that later formed solid sedimentary rock. Burrows caused by animal trails made in soft sediment that later formed solid sedimentary rock. Coprolites, which is fossilized species, or fossilized dung, as some people call it, and it could also include stomach contents. Gastroliths are fossilized stomach stones. So these are the 5 methods of fossilization. Let's look at some examples. Example number 1. Example 1 reads, which process would most likely preserve plant leaves? Our choices: A, carbonization, B, mold cast, C, petrifaction, and D, replacement. Because the leaf is very soft and it has little hard body parts, mold and cast and petrifaction would not be the most common choice. In this case, carbonization will be the best choice. The leaf will get buried rapidly in sediment, in an oxygen-poor environment, it would then get compressed by the overlying sediment when it was buried rapidly, and the volatile materials, such as liquids and gases, will get squeezed out, leaving an impression of the leaf, a carbon impression, which we call carbonization. Let's look at example number 2. What is the most common form of fossilization for woolly mammoths in northern Russia? In northern Russia, you have a very cold environment, so frozen remains would probably be the best answer. Example number 2. Which statement is true regarding the Miocene worm trace fossils that we see in the picture below? In this picture, we see burrows left behind by a worm. Our choices will be hard parts were preserved by petrifaction. This method or this choice would not apply because worms lack hard body parts, plus the fossil that we see in the diagram are burrows that is left behind by the worm as it burrowed through sediment. Choice B, no part of the worm has been preserved, which can be true. C, soft parts were preserved by carbonization. In this case, we do not see any residue of carbon as a fossil, so C would not be a good choice. And D, the worm has been preserved in its original form. Its original form would be soft parts, and we do not see any evidence of the worm preserved in this rock. What we do see is traces that the worm had once existed in the rock as burrows. So our answer in this case will be B. No part of the worm has been preserved. Instead, it is a trace fossil left behind by the presence of a worm moving through soft sediment. Your turn. Take time to complete the following questions. Solutions will follow. You can pause your recording now and answer the question below. The question below reads, a caribou dies and is laying on the edge of a river. Describe 2 conditions that favor the preservation of the remains of this specimen. The conditions responsible for preservation include 3 choices. The first choice is the presence of hard body parts. So down below you have 3 choices. Number 1 is hard body parts. Second choice, which is the second condition that helps preserve fossils, would be rapid burial. In fine sediment. And a third condition responsible for fossilization will be an oxygen poor environment. Out of these 3 choices, a caribou do have hard body parts made up of bones, teeth, antlers, etc. And seeing it's on the edge of a river where you do have high sedimentation, rapid burial is likely to have occurred. The third one, an oxygen-poor environment, may be in question when you look at the fossilization of a caribou on the side of a river. So let's look at the solution. The answer to the question, preservation of an organism is greatly increased when the following 2 conditions are met. The organism has hard body parts, and the organism is buried rapidly, generally by fine sediment. Other conditions that could promote preservation of this organism is the absence of scavengers and microbes such as bacteria, and organisms are buried in an environment in which is low oxygen. If it was a cold environment that the caribou lived in, the caribou could also get preserved by being frozen in snow or ice. So any of these conditions would be suitable for your answer. Let's answer another question. Take the time to complete the following question, and the solution will follow. The question below reads, fossils are commonly formed by the following methods: formation of mold and cast, and petrifaction by replacement. Describe these, including in your description the conditions necessary for fossilization to occur. So by looking at the question, what we need to do here is to describe the methods of fossilization, and also, as key, it asks you to include the conditions necessary for fossils to occur. And those would be the three conditions previously stated in the last slide. So if we look at our solution, we can see petrifaction requires hard body parts of an organism, such as bones or trees, and as they get buried rapidly in sediment, pores and cavities in the material takes in water, which then precipitates minerals to produce a solid replica of the organism, preserving all details, both external and internal details. So if we look at the petrification as a method of fossilization, we include our two conditions. We have hard body parts, it gets buried rapidly, and then we see the replacement of the original material by other minerals and such that move through in the water, that move through the organism. If we look at a mold and cast, mold and cast forms when organisms with hard parts get rapidly buried in sediment. The sediment compresses and hardens, the organism dissolves or decays, and an impression, which is called a mold, is left behind. For cast to form, an impression or mold fills in with sediment, or is filled with mineral matter, which then hardens, forming a solid representation of the organism. In this type of fossilization, only external features are fossilized. So these 2 points address the question that's outlined above. In summary, there are 3 conditions that are responsible for fossilization. You need hard body parts, rapid burial, and an oxygenless or oxygen-free environment. And we looked at 5 methods of fossilization. These include petrifaction, carbonization, mold and cast, preservation, and trace fossils. So petrifaction would involve the replacement of the material by mineral matter, and that preserves both internal and external details. Carbonization involves the releasing of volatile materials, such as liquids and gases, which then leaves a thin residue of carbon behind. Mold and cast involves the formation of a mold by an organism being compressed in soft sediment and later being dissolved away or broken down, leaving what is called a mold. This mold then gets filled in with sediment or fine mineral matter and is called the cast. Preservation is when an organism gets preserved in ice or amber and the full organism gets preserved intact, preserving all material, soft and hard. And finally, trace fossils are evidence that organisms once existed in a particular area. This can be examples such as tracks, fossilized feces such as coprolites, stomach stones, etc.